We would like to explain what David Cameron and George Osborne are not telling you about the European economic and financial situation. This is our film to challenge those government experts. Their analysis is so misleading. It's like trusting oil companies on global warming. We live in a global economy, and the EU is heading in the wrong direction. It's an unfair system, and you're gambling with our futures. This is our story about the EU's too-big-to-fail experiment, which the Brussels elites have foisted on the citizens of Europe to their great cost, which has led the youth unemployment of 30 to 50% across southern Europe. If we had figured this out, it cannot be complicated, but David Cameron wants to blind you with dodgy, unproven smears to scare you into supporting him. This film can help you make the simple decision about what's right and what's wrong for this country.
So, how do we get into this mess? In Europe, politicians created the one-size-fits-all euro, which allows everyone to go on a huge credit binge and rack up excessive debts. In fact, scarily, the euro was never designed to work. The architects knew the problems, but proceeded anyway. So, what does that mean? The scale and complexity of the EU economy is pretty easy to understand when simplified into the scale of our lives.
Imagine a man has a job and saves hard to pay a deposit on a home. The bank manager arranges a €200,000 mortgage and he buys the home. The business isn't going well, so his boss makes him redundant. He's struggling with the mortgage payment, so calls the bank. Thankfully, the bank says, "New rules. No need to worry if you cannot pay your mortgage. The government will now lend you money to pay the mortgage, and a bit extra to live on while you find you a job." What does he do? He doesn't need to work now because the government is paying him. This is the problem over the channel. The government cannot find jobs for people, so now they're handing out money. Our man has been giving €940,000, which is starting to look like he'll never pay it back. If you scale this back up to the whole economy, where the EU gross debt to GDP is 470%, you have a whole load of people who might not ever be able to pay it back, which sounds like a fairly dangerous way to run a country. The trouble is, when the situation inevitably goes belly up, it is us British taxpayers having to cover up for some of the losses. Which sounds to us like your friends taking a credit card and organising a party. It's all great fun and who cares to ask questions until you get the statement.
So, what are our leaders doing about it? The leadership in Brussels doesn't have any answers because the problem is so enormous and all they do is throw good money after bad to buy time. The first thing society needs to work is a firm set of ground rules.
Brussels doesn't enforce the rules. They sit around having meetings, denying problems and making excuses. There are 3 things you need to create jobs. 1. Boost investment spending to improve productivity and growth. 2. Business-friendly policies such as incentives to work. And 3. Less burdensome regulations.
But while they were dithering, the situation has got worse. The Germans don't like number 1 and want to impose unnecessary austerity on the rest of Europe. And the French really don't like number 2 or number 3. So, various rescue funds were launched.
In the end, things got so bad that the Germans were overruled, and Mario Draghi started printing money as QE. This is where the bank manager gave new instructions in the earlier example.
Everyone announced we were saved. And then what happened? So Mario is printing huge amounts of money. What about number 2 and number 3? The problem is that every time people are asked to work harder in France, the politicians run into problems. So the Eurozone economy is still stuck, with too much debt which caps the growth potential. The banking system has to keep giving people money more and more cheaply, so now we have negative interest rates.
Negative interest rates are so extraordinary. They show the ECB is forcing the other banks to use the money, refusing to take it back, a form of financial torture.
But they're not lending to businesses. The one-size-fits-all euro is also a big problem for countries in southern Europe. The euro is still too strong for businesses or tourism to be very attractive, so they have high unemployment and deficits. For countries in northern Europe, the euro is too weak, so they are exporting well and building up surpluses. All the money in Europe is being sucked up into Germany.
So, how does the whole situation end? There are only 2 options. 1, the narrow escape, and 2, the financial crisis. 1, the narrow escape. This is the Goldilocks story where in the next 1 to 2 years, 1. Brussels manages to transfer money from Northern Europe to boost investment in the south, which would meet with political resistance. 2. They manage to restructure the entire economy of France to encourage business. This is, as we know, is almost impossible. We need Brussels to completely reverse its heavy regulation policies. 2. Financial crisis. If the EU doesn't make those changes and just continues printing money and increasing the debt burden, then the economy will stagnate and unemployment will climb, meaning more migration to Britain. Total debt in Europe is 67 trillion euros. Eventually, the markets could lose confidence in the Eurozone's sovereign debt, Eurobanking, and system. The ECB cannot keep printing money indefinitely without generating disorderly inflation, which the Germans are certain to stop, or stagflation. If the money printing stops, interest rates start climbing to prevent inflation, then we have a cocktail of problems worse than Greece or Cyprus. What's truly unfair is that young people in Britain are sharing the greatest burden of the crisis. The referendum is taking a big gamble on Europe. That's right, most European governments are borrowing money to pay interest. They need to get people into work, and if they don't, it's a house of cards. But they're giving them more money anyway, when they try to buy time and hope something turns up.
Yes, because if they get it wrong, then we'll have to pay. For us, this is a simple question of what's right and wrong. We have no control over what they're doing, but when it goes wrong, we all have to pay. That seems very unfair. David Cameron is inventing all these scare stories, which are simply not true. I am only 15, but think that his claims sound very fishy and silly. Will another war really start if we leave the EU? And when should we expect the plague of locusts?
So, in conclusion, the EU elites have not made the right decisions from the start. The foundations and dream of utopia are all wrong because no one can agree on anything. Brussels is feeding the continent with a dog's breakfast of Euro misery. And when it fails, we pay.
For Britain, it's self-defeating. Like European football, we always lose the penalties. But on the 23rd of June, we will win.
Like,